Hey friends, welcome back to the Holistic Ease podcast and blog. I am your host, Erin Oberlander, certified holistic aromatherapist and herbalist and holistic health expert. It has been a little bit of time since I've been with you consistently, and I apologize. And today I'm going to fill you in a little bit on what's been going on in my world. The reason I want to share this with you is, first of all, not because I want advice and not because I want to hear horror stories from people, but because I want to get to a deeper issue today, and that is how to deal with like crippling anxiety when you are going through a medical crisis. So, on March 3rd, I was bitten by a dog on my thumb. And I am not going to share the details of that story other than to say it was my own dog. And it was something that was very unexpected, something that I would never have expected from this animal. But she was old, she was in pain, she didn't know what was going on, and I was in the wrong place at the wrong time. So I got bit by the dog, and it was like in my soul, I knew it was going to be bad. Typically I'm very optimistic, but I knew in that moment that it was bad news. The thumb swelled up terribly. I've been in and out of the doctor's office more times than I can even count in the last few months. And over that time, there was many cycles of thinking that the infection was getting better and the wound was healing, and then all of a sudden it would ramp back up again. And we went through this time and again, and it was cultured, and everything was done properly. Everything was done right, and I received excellent care all throughout the process. But a couple of weeks ago, I started to feel a lot of unrest in my spirit over the situation. And after everyone else went to bed one night, I stayed up and I was looking at all the photos of my wound, and I was like, I don't think this is getting better, and I really think I need to go in. And within 2 days of my having this conversation with myself, I was actually in surgery. And in the surgery, they removed some diseased tissue and bone. The bone was infected. And now I'm spending a length of time on IV antibiotics. So this has been a difficult thing to go through for me on a variety of levels. First of all, as a holistic health person, I'm not used to relying on modern medicine. And to have to be, surrendered to the point where you realize that the only path to healing is through taking an antibiotic or is through going to the doctor, that is a tough pill to swallow, truly, for me. But I realize also at the same time that allopathic medicine and natural forms of healing can coexist. And this has been a really great process for me to go through, because I've been able to really orchestrate a dance for myself and for my body between those two worlds, and seeing how one really can support the other. And so I've received excellent care medically, and I've been taking really great care of myself holistically, all the things that I need to do to support my body, extra rest, time away from work, occupational therapy, just everything that I needed to do. And then, of course, all the things to support what my body was really needing, like extra vitamins, extra supplementation, extra superfoods, just whatever I knew was going to help my body heal through this process. But the biggest challenge about going through this for me wasn't the bite itself. It wasn't the process of going through all the medical stuff. It was how my anxiety flared up in a way that it has not for about 10 years. So when I was in grad school years ago, I had a very sudden onset of a panic and anxiety disorder, where one moment I was completely fine, completely content in class, learning about French opera and art song, and the next minute I was in the emergency room thinking I was dying. And this was after another personal medical crisis. I had found a nodule on my thyroid. They were thinking it was cancer. I felt like it wasn't, but I still had to go through the process of getting partial thyroidectomy. And it was months later that my body, which had become used to this really high stress level of like, oh my gosh, I might have cancer, and then things started to calm down, and my cortisol and adrenaline were like, well, we're not used to being that low. And so it just surged in my body. And in my case, It was very, very severe. So if you read about panic and anxiety, what you'll read is that it's not life-threatening, that people don't commit suicide over this, that it's, it can be managed with drugs. None of those things were true for me. I was having hyperventilation, panic attacks, like very, very bad panic attacks from the moment I would wake up to the moment I would go to sleep, and very often would wake up throughout the night several times to have another panic attack. And this went on for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks. And my life and my experience in my life was getting smaller and smaller and smaller because I couldn't sit through a class. I couldn't sit through a rehearsal. I never could breathe. It was terrible. And I had never understood what anxiety was before I had this experience. I was always just like, well, why can't people just get over it? Don't be so stressed out. Don't talk yourself into things. And in this case, I wasn't talking myself into anything. I was perfectly happy. And then, boom, out of nowhere, my body started going haywire. It was trying to find homeostasis, and it couldn't find it. And it couldn't find it. And it couldn't find it. So, after several months of that, I was ready to check out. I couldn't do it anymore. And luckily, I had a very dear friend in my life at that time who got me into cognitive behavioral therapy. Now I'm a huge believer in cognitive behavioral therapy because it brought me from this very crippling place of extreme and constant panic back into homeostasis in my body within just a few weeks for me. Now, that's not everyone's experience, but I was in so much torment at that point that I was willing to do whatever it took. I was willing to do whatever it took to get myself well. So, cognitive behavioral therapy is in many ways an exposure therapy, but for me, the way that my therapist did it was that he taught me to just be a non-judgmental, very key word here, non-judgmental observer of my anxiety symptoms. So what that meant was that when I started to feel the feelings of panic start to rise in my body, I would learn to just turn on my inner observer and say, oh, well, that's interesting. I'm feeling that panic right now in my upper stomach. It feels like tension. It feels like butterflies. I feel like my chest is tightening. I'm just going to observe this, and I'm going to watch if it gets worse or better. And sometimes it would get worse, and sometimes it would get better. And what happened for me, and what very often happens for folks, is that as you learn to not be judgmental of yourself while you're going through the panic, while you're going through the anxiety, that removes a layer of pressure from your body. Because usually when you're having anxiety, when you're having panic, you're like, I have to stop panicking, or I shouldn't feel like this. And you're in a shame spiral at the same time. And you're putting this pressure on yourself that you shouldn't be feeling this thing that you're legitimately feeling, and that you might not actually be able to do anything about in that moment. And so taking away that element of judgment allows you just to sit with the anxiety and learn to ride it out, learn to float in it, learn to exist in it, and to just like see it and learn from it. Let it be a teacher instead of a tormentor. So this is what I learned in cognitive behavioral therapy. Now, I am not a cognitive behavioral therapist. I'm not a mental health professional. I'm just personally sharing my story with you. So if you're going through a season like this, whether it's anxiety, depression, or something else, mental health, I really do encourage you to get help, because there is help out there. And I did it as a poor grad student that didn't have health insurance. So do it. It's going to help you so much, and it might not take as much work as you think. So I was out of therapy within 2 months. I was kind of back on my feet, but what my therapist told me was like, don't get cocky. Always practice your techniques. Even if you're not feeling anxious, see if you can make yourself feel anxious, and see if you can observe non-judgmentally the feelings that you feel in your body. And so over the years, off and on, I've done that. And over the years, off and on, I might have had a period of stress where I was feeling a little bit of anxiety, but it has been nothing like it has been the last 3 months dealing with this ongoing infection, because there's been so many unknowns and there's been so many fears. There's also the fact that a lot of people in my family are very reactive to a wide variety of medical things like medicines or procedures, contrast dyes, like all of that. So there's just like a general terror level going into a doctor's office for me in the first place. And then having to explain that, and then having to explain MTHFR, and then having to explain, other things that I know that my body is dealing with right now. It just feels very overwhelming sometimes. And if you've ever been through a season of a medical crisis of any kind, you can understand what I'm talking about. It's hard enough to sometimes even remember when your next appointment is, much less the questions that you need to ask and all of that. And so what happened to me through this process is that, exactly as my therapist had told me, I started experiencing really extreme anxiety and panic symptoms again. But this was not my first day at the rodeo. So what was so interesting this time is that I knew I was going to create some ground rules for myself. And for those of you listening, this is what I want to focus on today. And then in a second podcast episode, I'm going to tell you some holistic tools that I used to help to support my body, to support my emotions through this process. But right now, what I want to talk about is the really extremely high value of setting really strong boundaries with people when you are going through a medical crisis, especially if you are feeling stressed or anxious. Because in my experience, this is not the first time I've been through a medical crisis season, what people speak over you during these times has far more power than you realize. So the people that deserve to speak in your life, such as your primary care physician, your specialists, your naturopaths, your mental health professionals, they get that space. Other people's opinions, other people's experiences, other people's horror stories do not get that space, and they don't get to speak into your life, because that stuff is what's really going to get your anxiety going. Just like doing Dr. Google and looking up your condition and all the worst case scenario stuff. And believe me, I've been guilty of doing this. I would not let myself go there this time. I really allowed myself to rely on the medical professionals and the people around me that I knew understood where I was mentally and emotionally and spiritually and physically, and could actually hold that space with maturity without making it about them, and with understanding that sometimes I might need to talk and sometimes I might need to not talk about this at all. So for me, what that looked like was only asking my health professional health questions, not the internet, which meant I had to learn to ask for help more often than I like. It was a lot more phone calls to the doctors, to talk to the nurses than I have ever done. But what I found is, like, actually talking to the people that work with this stuff day in and day out is much more instructive than having somebody come up to me in a public setting and tell me their experience and how bad it was. That's not helpful. And if you are around someone who's going through a medical crisis, I understand why you're doing that, right? Like, you are trying to find a point of connection with this person that is in pain. You are trying to find a way to relate to them. You're trying to find something to say and something to talk about. Understand that someone that's going through a medical crisis is not going to benefit from hearing your cousin's aunt's babysitter's horror story about their medical thing that might sound the same as this person that you're trying to connect with. That kind of interaction can be not just negative, it can be very, very devastating to someone who is doing everything that they can do just to hold body and soul together, to take the next breath, to do the next right thing. And it also makes it really confusing for that person. So what happens when you're going through a crisis and when you're stressed, and especially if you're an anxiety person, you go through something called amygdala hijack. So your amygdala is the part of your brain, it's the emotional center of your brain that also does your fight or flight. And when your fight or flight gets turned on, especially when it gets overly active, as in the case of anxiety and panic, it's an amygdala hijack, which means the amygdala basically takes over most of the rest of your brain. especially your prefrontal cortex, which is the part that usually can do the higher functioning, can do the decision making, that can weed out the negative comments, that can ignore, somebody's trying to be overly helpful. You actually don't have that ability from a brain standpoint when you're going through a medical crisis. So somebody's offhanded comment that you might not even notice on a normal day can completely derail you feeling okay with your care plan, your provider, your situation, without that person even realizing that they've done that. So for those of you that are walking near someone who's going through a medical crisis, what I want to encourage you to do is just simply to become familiar with the idea of sitting with someone else's pain without feeling like you need to offer something verbal. Other than, I'm sorry that you're going through this. I'm here if you need to talk. Because generally, even if you feel like you're being really helpful and you feel like you're being really encouraging, telling somebody those horror stories, telling them even the good stories, or telling them things like, oh, just trust God and everything's going to be okay, is really unhelpful. Because now you've told that person that they shouldn't be anxious or stressed, and that the reason that they're anxious and stressed is because they're inadequate in some way as a human, and also their faith in God or whatever they believe in also is weak. And that may not be the case at all. In my initial experience with anxiety, it was purely a physical response that my body was going through. My faith walk had never been stronger at that time when it happened. And yet the most discouraging people in my life were people of faith who were coming up to me saying things like, well, you just need to trust God. Well, really, what does that mean to you? Because I trust God, but I also know that God is going to ask me to do hard things, and that I'm probably going to have to walk through some fires in my life. That's realistic. So when people are giving those pat answers, I always think of it like the greeting card sayings. Don't do that to people. It causes them a lot more stress. Then they have to come up with a way to respond to you that's not angry, mean, cold, or threatening. They have to hold space for your uncomfortableness with their feelings. So again, I come back to, if you're walking near somebody that is going through a medical crisis or really any kind of a hard time, learn to be able to coexist with someone's pain without feeling like you have to try to say something about it or make it better. That is honestly the best thing that you can do for them. If you are the person that's going through the medical crisis, what I want to say to you is that this is the time where you get to make the most hardcore boundaries of your life. So what this has looked like for me is that I have needed community. Like I was sick to the point where there was a little stretch of time where I was actually unable to take care of myself. I was laid up, was not able to do anything with my hands. I was very physically weak. I was post-surgery. I had to rely upon my mom, my parents, my family, my husband to quite literally take care of my basic needs. This is very humbling, but it also teaches you who those people are that get to speak into your life at this time. I also have a close group of girlfriends that knows how to hold space in a really healthy way, that I would share my concerns and still am sharing my concerns with them. And there's a real sense of being held in that. But everyone else, I still wanted to reach out and explain my situation, to ask for prayers, to ask for good vibes, because I believe that those things are effective. I believe they're effective from a spiritual standpoint, and I believe they're effective because of quantum physics. But what I did is, when I made those requests, I did them as social media posts, and I always prefaced my post as saying, not asking for advice or stories, this is what I need. So this is where you put your boundaries in. Telling people, I don't need advice right now, and I don't need stories right now, but this is what I could really use from you, is so helpful. And not one single time did I have anyone say anything in the comments that was unsettling to me, except for one that I believe actually was used by God to get me into the next level of care I needed to not have this become an even more serious situation than it was. So this is the time for you to also maybe withdraw a little bit more from social activities. Now, this is a really tricky thing with anxiety because anxiety can become agoraphobic really quickly. You can begin to think that you're only safe in your bubble and that you can I'm finishing my podcast, Mom. See, my mom's coming to help me. I'm finishing my podcast. I just need like 5 more minutes. My mom is my nurse right now, and she helps me with my PICC line. And every day at this time, I get my IV antibiotics in, and they're making my body better, and I'm grateful for them. So, but with going through a medical crisis, there's a couple of things going on. You might have compromised immunity, and you might need to withdraw from people. If we've seen anything in the last year, we've seen that that can be quite an effective thing for someone with their health. But the other thing is that as soon as you go into groups of people, if you have anything visible going on with your medical condition, such as this, you get, like the comments from the grocery checkout guy, like, oh, it looks like something's wrong with your thumb. And somebody at church comes up to you and wants to tell you a horror story. And somebody in the grocery store wants to ask you a million questions about your medical condition, even though you've already posted all this stuff on social media so that you wouldn't have to say it a million times. Those situations, if you are in high anxiety land, if you're like above a 5 on a scale of 1 to 10, these are not healthy places to necessarily be. So my advice is to give yourself as much choosiness with your personal space and geographic location as you need in this moment. And just know that it is okay to give yourself that space. You don't owe anybody else an explanation about your medical situation. And you also don't owe somebody else the time to hear their horror story when your true focus during a medical crisis truly does need to be on getting yourself better and healing yourself. So I wanted to just come out here and say this, first of all, that if you are going through a medical crisis or any kind of a crisis and you are going through a time of anxiety and you are going through a time of panic, I get it. And you know what? It's normal. It's normal. And I think we need to normalize it and we need to talk about it more. And within that, I want you to feel like you can say no to some things and that you can define how you want people to interact with you when it comes to this subject during this time period. This is something that I wish that someone had said to me 10 years ago, because I think that it would not have gone so nuclear for me with my anxiety. I was still in a little bit of a people-pleasing mentality at that time, trying not to offend people, trying not to step on any toes. And now I realize that when I'm going through something like this, my true job right now is to focus on getting myself better. The more people try to give me their opinions, try to share their horror stories, need me to explain myself, the less energy I have to put into focusing on getting myself healed. And this is true of anyone walking through a season like this. So if you're going through it, give yourself permission to say no. Give yourself permission to say, I don't want advice. Give yourself permission to say, I don't need to hear your stories, but this is what I do need from you. And what you're going to find is that people actually respond really well to that because they want to do something to help you. They feel helpless because you're going through this and they know that they can't take your physical pain away. They wish they could, and so they feel awkward and they want to do something. So this is what you can actually do for them. You can actually tell them, I don't want that thing, but I really could use this. And it sets them at ease, and then it also protects you from having those things spoken over you that can be so damaging when you're walking through a season like this. So that's what I have for you today. Next podcast, I'm going to share with you my favorite holistic tools to get through a medical crisis when you're dealing with stress and anxiety. So be looking for that, and I will see you next time.